The winter winds of 1777 cut across the American camps like blades, carrying with them the echo of a truth no soldier wanted to admit. The revolution was dying. After brutal losses in New York and the relentless chase across New Jersey, whispers spread through the ranks that perhaps the dream of independence had been nothing more than a desperate gamble. Congress was broke, the army was hungry, and the British seemed unstoppable. Yet, in the middle of this despair, something was beginning to stir, something fragile, uncertain, and dangerous. It began far from the battlefield, in the quiet chambers of European courts, where kings and ministers watched the struggling colonies with cold calculation. If the Americans were to survive, they needed more than courage. They needed allies, powerful allies. But no nation dared challenge the British Empire, not yet. Meanwhile, in North America, a British plan was unfolding that could crush the rebellion for good. General John Burgoyne, confident and flamboyant, led a massive British force south from Canada. His goal was simple: slice the colonies in half by seizing control of the Hudson River. If he succeeded, New England, the cradle of rebellion, would be isolated and strangled. The British High Command believed this campaign would break the Americans completely. Burgoyne marched with cannons, thousands of soldiers, loyalists, and native allies. His triumph felt guaranteed, and yet, in the shadows of his certainty, fate was quietly crafting a different ending. As Burgoyne's army pushed south, the wilderness itself turned against him. Dense forests swallowed supply wagons. Swamps devoured horses. Every mile carved through the wilderness was paid for with exhaustion and time. And time was the one thing the British could not afford to lose. American militia, small in number but fierce in spirit, harassed the British from every direction. They attacked supply lines, ambushed scouting parties, vanished into the trees, and reappeared where least expected. Their message was clear. Burgoyne was marching into a trap he could not yet see. In a small farmhouse turned headquarters, American General Horatio Gates studied maps, aware that for the first time in months, he held a real advantage. The Americans were gathering farmers, blacksmiths, hunters, veterans, ordinary men forced into extraordinary roles. And among them, a figure rode with unmistakable fire: Benedict Arnold. Before betrayal would stain his name forever, Arnold was a warrior of terrifying brilliance, a man who charged into danger with reckless devotion. Though he clashed constantly with Gates, one thing united them both: the knowledge that Saratoga would determine the fate of the revolution. The first clash came at Freeman's farm. Smoke curled above the trees as muskets cracked like thunder. The British advanced in rigid lines, disciplined and deadly, but the Americans fought with a desperation that shook their enemies' confidence. Arnold led wild charges, rallying men whose legs trembled with fear. Again and again, the British tried to break the American line, but each time they pushed forward, the forest erupted with gunfire and chaos. At nightfall, the ground was soaked with blood, yet neither side claimed victory. But something had changed. For the first time, Burgoyne realized the enemy before him was not the ragtag mob he had imagined. They were learning. They were adapting. And worse, they were growing stronger. The second battle, fought weeks later at Bemis Heights, shattered any illusions Burgoyne had left. The Americans struck with explosive force, their movements coordinated with a precision unseen earlier in the war. And at the center of it all, Arnold Fires fearless stormed into battle against orders. He rode through British lines, sword drawn, shouting commands as if possessed. His horse fell, his leg shattered. Yet, even as he lay wounded, his assault had shattered the British defenses. Burgoyne's army, once proud and invincible, began to crumble. With no supplies, no reinforcements, and winter closing in, Burgoyne faced the unthinkable. On a cold October morning, he surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men, to the Americans. The world froze in disbelief. The impossible had happened. A colonial army had defeated one of the greatest empires on earth. And far across the ocean, in the glittering courts of Europe, kings and ministers felt the tremor of that victory. France, Britain's ancient enemy, leaned forward with sudden interest. If the Americans could defeat a British army alone, what might they accomplish with help? Benjamin Franklin, wrapped in his simple fur hat, walked the halls of Versailles with quiet confidence. The French adored him. They saw in him a symbol of freedom, wit, and revolution. Still, France hesitated until news of Saratoga arrived. Suddenly, hesitation vanished. Saratoga had proven that supporting the Americans was not a risk. It was an opportunity. Marquis de Lafayette became like a son to Washington, bringing enthusiasm, resources, and a belief that America's fight was humanity's fight. Then came Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer with sharp eyes and a sharp tongue. He saw immediately that the American army had courage but little discipline, no uniform training, and wildly inconsistent techniques. If they were to stand against the British, they needed transformation. And so, the story shifted to a place that would be remembered in whispers for generations. Valley Forge. Winter arrived with brutal indifference. Snow buried the camps, and wind clawed through the thin tents. Thousands of soldiers shivered in rags, frostbite gnawing at their skin. Food was scarce. Supplies nearly non-existent. Men collapsed from hunger, from cold, from sickness. The Continental Army stood on the edge of annihilation without a single British musket firing a shot. Yet, within this despair came a miracle in human form. Von Steuben. He drilled the soldiers relentlessly, but with purpose. He shouted, corrected, demonstrated every maneuver himself. At first, the men grumbled, but slowly, painfully, they began to move like a unified force. Their steps synchronized. Their volleys tightened. Their confidence grew. And through it all, George Washington walked among them, silent but unbroken, a figure of resolve anchoring the spirit of the army. By spring, the men who emerged from Valley Forge were not the same soldiers who had limped into that winter. They were disciplined, sharper, stronger, and ready. News of France's alliance reached camp like a spark in dry grass. Cheers erupted. Men wept. For the first time, they felt the weight on their shoulders lighten. They were no longer alone. The greatest navy in the world was now on their side. The British knew this changed everything. Their grip on America was slipping, not because their power had faded, but because the Americans had gained something far greater than weapons or ships. They had gained legitimacy. They had become a nation others believed could win. Saratoga had been more than a battle. It was the moment the revolution stopped being a desperate rebellion and became a global struggle for freedom. It shattered the illusion of British invincibility and ignited a fire that stretched from Boston to Paris. What followed would test the Americans in ways they could not yet imagine, but the tide of the war had turned. And though the darkness of conflict still lay ahead, the world had begun to believe in the impossible. Because on that battlefield in 1777, where smoke drifted through shattered trees and muskets lay silent among the fallen, the Americans had proven something that echoed far beyond their own shores, that an army of farmers, merchants, and dreamers could defy an empire. And that single truth would change history forever.